Europe felt like a powder keg ready to blow in the summer of 1914. Far away in Nebraska, Henry Lawson worked his wheat fields under the hot sun. His hands were rough from the work, his face lined from years of weather. He lived a quiet life with his wife Clara. Evenings found Clara sewing by the light of an oil lamp. The soft shush of her needle through cloth, a familiar sound. News from across the ocean came slowly, in crumpled newspapers, days or weeks old. One hot July day, the paper brought shocking news. A man named Archduke Franz Ferdinand, important to a country called Austria-Hungary, had been shot dead in a place called Sarajevo. Henry read the words aloud to Clara on their porch. "They killed an archduke," he said, shaking his head. It seemed like trouble far away, something that didn't touch their peaceful farm. But the papers kept talking about countries making promises to help each other if someone attacked. But soon, the news grew worse. Austria-Hungary declared war on a small country called Serbia. Then, like dominoes falling, other countries joined in. Germany, Russia, France, Britain, all throwing themselves into a huge fight. Henry spread the paper out on the kitchen table. Maps showed Europe, but now covered in arrows and dark lines. "Looks like the whole place is catching fire," he said quietly. Clara stopped her sewing, her face worried. "Those poor people," she murmured. "All those young men." Henry nodded. He thought of the young men he knew in town, was glad the ocean was wide. Life on the farm went on. Henry harvested his wheat. Clara put up preserves. But the war news was always there, a shadow in the background. The papers called it the Great War. They showed pictures of soldiers in strange muddy ditches called trenches. Henry saw young faces, not much older than the boys who helped him sometimes, looking tired and scared under metal helmets. He read about terrible new weapons. Machine guns that spat bullets like rain. Huge cannons that shook the earth for miles, and poison gas that choked men to death. It sounded like a nightmare. Then, in May 1915, news came that struck closer to home. A big passenger ship called the Lusitania, sailing from America to Britain, was sunk by a German submarine. Many people drowned. Among them were 128 Americans. The news hit the small town like a hammer blow. Henry's neighbor, Ben Shaw, a mechanic with 2 young boys, slammed his fist down on the counter at the general store. "They're droning our people," Ben shouted, his face red with anger, "right out in the open sea. Innocent folks just traveling." Henry felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The war wasn't just in Europe anymore. It had reached out and touched Americans. He saw the fear in Clara's eyes when she heard. She held onto his arm tightly that night. President Wilson kept saying America should stay out, stay neutral. Henry wanted to believe that was possible. He wanted the wide ocean to keep them safe. Reading the paper became harder. He saw pictures of the muddy trenches where soldiers lived like rats. He learned about a young German soldier, Karl Vogel, freezing in the wet mud of France, writing letters to his girl back home, Elise. Karl wasn't so different from the boys Henry knew. He was probably scared and missing his family, just like anyone would be. Kaiser Wilhelm talked of victory for Germany. King George promised Britain would never give up. The fighting seemed endless, a grinding machine chewing up lives. Henry walked his fields, the rich Nebraska soil yielding under his boots. The sky was wide and blue, peaceful. But the world felt smaller now and darker. The storm that had started with a single shot in Sarajevo was raging across Europe. It felt powerful, unstoppable. Henry looked east, towards the distant ocean, a question forming in his mind that he didn't want to ask out loud. Would the storm stay over there? Or would the winds of war eventually reach their quiet shores? The peaceful hum of insects in the tall grass suddenly sounded fragile. The peaceful fields of Nebraska felt far away in April of 1917. Samuel Lawson read the newspaper headline again, the words feeling heavy in his hands. President Wilson had asked Congress to declare war on Germany. America was joining the fight. For months, the arguments had raged. German submarines kept sinking ships, even American ones. Telegrams arrived in town, telling families their sons or husbands were lost at sea. People felt angry and scared. Samuel's neighbor, Raymond Bell, a strong mechanic with 2 little boys, came over, his face grim. "They killed more of ours, Sam," Raymond said, pointing at the paper. "President says we gotta make the world safe. What's that mean for us?" It meant signing up. Posters appeared everywhere. Tall men in uniforms pointed stern fingers. "I want you for us, Army," they declared. "Do your part." Samuel felt a pull deep inside. It wasn't just anger at the submarines. It was the pictures he'd seen of French towns destroyed, of soldiers stuck in muddy trenches. He thought of Raymond's boys growing up in a world where such things could happen. Clara, Samuel's wife, tried to hide her tears. She knew arguing wouldn't stop him. "You come back," she whispered fiercely, clutching his work-roughened hands. "You'll promise me, Samuel Lawson. You'll come back." Their son Daniel, only 12, tried to look brave, but his eyes were wide with fear. "I'll take care of the farm, Pa," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Samuel ruffled his hair, a lump in his own throat. Samuel and Raymond went together to the recruitment office in the county seat. The line was long, a colorful mix of men, farmers in faded overalls, shopkeepers in neat shirts, young men barely out of school. They were all just ordinary folks. Samuel signed his name with a careful hand. Raymond did the same, his signature bold and quick. They were given papers and told to report to Camp Victory in Kansas. Saying goodbye was the hardest thing Samuel had ever done. Clara held him tight, her face buried in his shoulder. Daniel clung to his leg. Raymond's wife, Martha, stood pale and silent, holding her sons close. The train whistle blew, a sharp, lonely sound. Samuel and Raymond climbed aboard, waving from the window until their families were just tiny dots on the platform. Camp Victory was a shock. It was a sea of tents and wooden huts, filled with the shouts of sergeants and the tramp of boots. Samuel and Raymond were given stiff uniforms that didn't fit quite right and heavy boots that blistered their feet. They learned to stand in straight lines, to march in step, to handle a long rifle that felt cold and strange. They practiced putting on clumsy gas masks, their breath turning to fog inside the rubber, making them feel panicked and trapped. Samuel met the men who would share his tent. Joseph Carter was a quiet schoolteacher from New York City, his hands more used to chalk than a rifle. Patrick Murphy was a loud, friendly dock worker from Boston, full of jokes to hide his nerves. They were all different, but the same worry lived in their eyes. They wrote letters home. Samuel told Clara about the dust storms and the tough training, careful not to scare her. Raymond sketched pictures of his boys on scraps of paper. Weeks turned into months. The drills got harder, the marches longer. They learned to dig trenches in the Kansas dirt, to crawl under barbed wire while guns fired blanks overhead. They practiced charging across open fields, the sergeants screaming at them to move faster. Samuel's farmer muscles grew harder, but a different kind of tiredness settled in. The tiredness of waiting for the real thing. Then the orders came. They were shipping out to France. A huge troop ship, the Liberty, waited at the dock in New York. It was a floating city of khaki uniforms and anxious faces. Samuel stood at the railing, looking back at the city skyline. Clara had given him a small locket before he left Camp Victory. Inside was a tiny picture of her and Daniel. He held it tight in his pocket now. "Come back to me," her last words echoed. Below deck, the air was thick and smelled of sweat and disinfectant. Joseph tried to teach Patrick chess on a small board to pass the time. Raymond looked at his sketches, tracing his boys' faces with a thick finger. Samuel watched the Statue of Liberty grow smaller and smaller, her torch fading into the gray distance. The wide ocean stretched ahead, dark and unknown. Somewhere across that water, the muddy trenches waited and the guns roared for real. Samuel Lawson, the Nebraska farmer, was sailing straight into the storm. France was cold and wet. Rain fell almost every day. Samuel Lawson felt the mud sucking at his boots as he stumbled off the train. Everything was gray. The sky, the buildings, the faces of the tired French people watching them pass. Trucks took Samuel, Raymond, Joseph, and Patrick towards the front. The rumble of distant thunder grew louder. It wasn't thunder, it was guns. It reached the trenches. Samuel looked down into a deep ditch filled with sticky mud and water. Wooden boards tried to make a path, but they sank. The smell hit him hard. Wet earth, rotting things, stale sweat, and something sharp and sour he didn't know. Men huddled in dugouts scooped into the trench walls. Their uniforms were caked in mud. Their eyes looked empty. "This is home," muttered a weary soldier. "Already there." Raymond spat into the mud. Home, more like a grave. Life became a routine of mud, cold, and fear. They stood watch at night, peering into the dark space called no man's land, a wasteland of broken trees, barbed wire and shell holes filled with water. Rats scurried everywhere, big and bold. Sleep was hard. The guns never truly stopped. Sometimes it was a distant boom. Sometimes the earth shook violently as shells exploded terrifyingly close, showering them with dirt and filth. Patrick called the endless noise the devil's own music. They learned to move low and fast. A head above the trench could mean death from a sniper. Joseph, the quiet teacher, read letters from his sister over and over. Raymond sketched his boys on scraps of damp paper. Samuel held Clara's locket tightly in his pocket. He wrote letters when he could find dry paper, telling her about the French countryside. Careful never to describe the trenches, the rats, or the constant fear. Then came the order. Dawn attack. Whistles blew, sharp and piercing. Over the top, "Go, go," shouted the officers. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs. He climbed the muddy ladder, scrambled over the sandbags, and ran into the gray morning mist. Raymond was beside him, Joseph and Patrick just ahead. Bullets cracked past them like angry hornets. Men screamed and fell. Samuel tripped, landing face first in freezing mud. He scrambled up, gasping. He saw Patrick stumble. A spray of red bloomed on Patrick's chest. He fell backwards. Joseph yelled and dragged him towards a shell hole for cover. Samuel and Raymond ran to help. They pulled Patrick into the shallow crater. Joseph pressed his hands against the wound, but the blood flowed fast. Patrick looked up, his face pale. "Hurts, ... bad," he gasped. Joseph whispered something, maybe a prayer. Patrick's eyes stared at the gray sky, then saw nothing. He was gone. The attack faltered. They crawled back to their own trenches, dragging Patrick's body. Mud and blood covered them. Samuel felt numb. Later, helping clear debris, he saw something in the mud near a collapsed trench wall. It was a waterlogged letter. The writing was strange, not English. He picked it up carefully. A name, Elise. He couldn't read the words, but he saw a pressed, faded flower fall out, a little white blossom. Samuel thought of Clara. He looked towards the German trenches, hidden by smoke and mist. He saw movement. A face, young like Daniel, pale and scared under the rim. Their eyes met for just a second. Samuel didn't raise his rifle. The young German didn't either. He vanished back into the smoke. Samuel thought of the letter in his hand. Somewhere, a girl named Elise waited, just like Clara. He folded the wet paper and tucked it into his pocket. That night, in the stinking dugout, Samuel couldn't stop seeing Patrick fall, or the young German's frightened face. The war wasn't about flags or kings anymore. It was about mud and blood and boys dying far from home. The autumn of 1918 brought cold rain and harder fighting. Samuel Lawson and Raymond Bell had been in France for months. They were different men now, harder and quieter. The news said a big American push was coming, near a place called the Argonne Forest. The goal was a town named Sedan. They marched for days, tired and wet, joining thousands of other soldiers. The forest was thick and dark. Rain dripped from the leaves. Every shadow could hide danger. Raymond, now a sergeant, led their small group. Samuel stayed close to his friend. Joseph Carter, the schoolteacher, walked behind them, his face grim since Patrick's death. They were all tired down to their bones. The battle had been going for weeks. 47 days of constant noise and fear. They called it the Mazargan Offensive. It felt endless. One gray morning, orders came down. Their platoon had to clear a wooded hill. German machine guns were hidden there, spitting death into the valley below. They moved slowly, crawling through wet underbrush, rifles ready. The sharp crack of bullets snapped branches overhead. Men fell, crying out. Samuel kept low, his heart pounding against the cold ground. Raymond signaled them forward with a sharp hand motion. They found the machine gun nest dug into the side of the hill, hidden by logs. 2 Germans were firing, their backs turned. Samuel and 2 others rushed them. There was a brief, fierce struggle. Grunts, the thud of rifle butts, a choked-off cry. It was over quickly. The German gun fell silent. Samuel caught his breath, leaning against the muddy bank. Then he saw movement in a corner of the dugout. A wounded German soldier lay huddled, clutching his side. Blood soaked his gray uniform. His face was pale, streaked with dirt. Samuel recognized him. It was the young soldier whose eyes he'd met across no man's land weeks before. Karl Vogel. Raymond raised his rifle, his face hard. "One less," he muttered, finger tightening on the trigger. Samuel grabbed Raymond's arm. "Wait, Ray, look at him. It's done. He's just... tired. Like us." Samuel remembered the letter to Elise. He remembered Clara. Raymond hesitated, his jaw clenched. He looked from the terrified young German to Samuel's pleading eyes. Slowly, he lowered his rifle. "All right, Sam," he sighed, the anger draining away, replaced by exhaustion. "All right, at the medic." They bandaged Karl's wound roughly with field dressings. 2 stretcher bearers carried him away towards the American rear lines. Karl looked back at Samuel once, confusion and fear still in his eyes, but maybe a flicker of something else. Relief. The next day, the push continued. The forest thinned. They crossed a field, churned into mud by shells. Dawn was just breaking, gray and cold. Suddenly, the world exploded. A German shell landed terrifyingly close. Samuel was thrown to the ground, dirt raining down on him. He scrambled up, ears ringing. Then he heard Raymond scream. He found his friend lying in the mud. Shrapnel, sharp metal from the shell, had torn through Raymond's right leg. It was a terrible mess below the knee. Blood soaked the mud dark red. Raymond's face was white as chalk, his teeth clenched against the pain. "Medic! Medic!" Samuel yelled, pressing his hands hard above the worst of the bleeding. Joseph ran up, his face horrified. "Ah!" It felt like hours, but help came quickly. "Yeah, field ambulance. Just a cart, really." Bounced over the rough ground. They lifted Raymond onto it. Samuel ran beside it, holding his friend's hand all the way to the field hospital. The hospital was chaos. Rows of tents, the smell of blood and disinfectant sharp in the cold air. Nurses moved swiftly, their faces calm, but their eyes sad. A young nurse named Louise Grant, her apron already stained, took charge. She looked at Raymond's leg, her expression serious but not panicked. "Needs to come off," she said quietly to the surgeon. "Now." Samuel and Joseph waited outside the tent. They heard Raymond's muffled cry, sharp and awful, then silence. Louise came out later, wiping her hands on a bloody cloth. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. "He's alive. He lost the leg, but he's strong. He'll make it." She looked exhausted. "He asked for you before they put him under. He said to tell his boys he fought clean." Samuel nodded, relief washing over him, mixed with a deep, aching sadness for his friend. He found paper and a pencil. He wrote to Martha, Raymond's wife. "Dear Martha," he began, his hand shaking slightly. "Ray was brave today, real brave. He saved 20 men, leading us right. Got hurt bad, lost his leg, but the nurses say he's gonna pull through. Fought clean, Martha. He wanted you and the boys to know that." Samuel stopped. He didn't write about the screams, didn't write about the mud, or the blood, or the terrible noise. He folded the letter carefully. Later, as a light snow began to dust the ruined ground, whispers spread through the exhausted men. "Heard the Germans are asking for peace, ... Talk of an armistice, ... Samuel looked out at the scarred land, thinking of Raymond in the hospital tent. Of Karl Vogel, somewhere behind them, of Clara and Daniel far away. The push toward Sedan felt less important suddenly. Maybe, just maybe, the storm was finally passing. But the cost felt carved deep into the earth and into every man who had survived it. November 11th, 1918. The cold morning air bit Samuel Lawson in his face as he crouched in a muddy trench, near Sedan. The endless thunder of guns had become the world's only sound for so long. Then word began to pass down the line, whispered from soldier to soldier like a fragile secret. Armistice. 11 o'clock. Ceasefire. Samuel checked his watch, a cheap tin thing. 10 minutes to 11. The shelling seemed to grow wilder, a final furious outburst. He huddled lower, pressing himself into the cold earth. 9 minutes. 8. The explosions felt closer, more desperate. 7 minutes. 6. He thought of Raymond, lying in a hospital bed somewhere, missing a leg. He thought of Patrick Murphy, buried somewhere in French soil. 5 minutes. 4. He clutched Clara's locket inside his pocket. 3 minutes. 2. The guns roared. One last terrible time. 1 minute. Silence fell. It wasn't quiet at first. Samuel's ears rang fiercely, a high-pitched whine blocking out everything else. Then slowly, the ringing faded, and he heard it. Nothing. No distant booms. No sharp cracks of rifle fire. No whistle of shells. Just silence. An immense, heavy, unbelievable silence settled over the broken land. Men began to climb slowly out of the trenches.
Alice.
Samuel stood up, his legs stiff and cold. He looked around. Soldiers stood like statues in the mud of no man's land. French, American, British, German. They just stood there, staring at each other across the ruined ground, across the tangled wire and the water-filled craters. No one raised a rifle, no one shouted. They simply existed in the sudden, shocking quiet. The war was over. Samuel walked slowly back through the trenches. The silence felt louder than the guns ever had. He passed helmets resting on rifles stuck bayonet first into the earth. Markers for the dead. He touched one gently. It belonged to young Peter Wells, who'd lied about his age to fight. He saw Joseph Carter sitting on an ammunition box, staring at a chess piece Patrick had carried. Marie Dubois, the brave French girl who guided them through minefields, leaned against a wall, tears cutting clean paths through the dirt on her face. He went to the field hospital. The tents were still full, but the frantic rush was gone. Nurse Louise Grant looked exhausted, but she managed a small, tired smile when she saw him. "He's awake," she said softly, leading Samuel to Raymond's cat. Raymond lay propped up, a rough blanket covering the space where his leg had been. His face was pale, etched with pain, but his eyes were clear. "Sam," he rasped. Samuel took his friend's hand. "We made it, Ray," Samuel said, his voice thick. "It's over." Raymond squeezed his hand weakly. "Tell Martha. Tell the boys." He paused, gathering strength. "Tell him I fought clean. Tell him I'm coming home." Louise nodded, placing a hand on Raymond's shoulder. "We'll get you home, Sergeant," she promised. Months later, Samuel stood on the porch of his Nebraska farmhouse. It was 1919. Spring was trying to push through the brown earth. Clara stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Daniel, taller now, stood a little way off, unsure. Samuel looked out over his fields, the same fields he had left 2 years before. It should have felt peaceful. It should have felt like coming home. But the wide, quiet sky felt strange. The familiar sounds of the farm, the cows, the wind in the grass, felt too loud sometimes, or not loud enough. When Clara touched him unexpectedly, he flinched. Ghosts lived in his bones. The whistle blowing for the attack, the sound of Patrick falling, Raymond's scream, the crushing silence of November 11th. Daniel showed him a newspaper clipping about a big victory parade planned in the city. Pictures showed smiling soldiers and cheering crowds. Samuel looked at the faces in the picture, saw men with eyes like his own, hollow, seeing things that weren't there. He didn't see heroes, saw men carrying a heavy, invisible weight. One evening, Samuel found the waterlogged German letter in his old uniform pocket. The paper was brittle, the writing faded, but the name Elise was still clear. He remembered the young soldier, Karl Vogel, his frightened eyes in the dugout.
Ow.
Samuel carefully wrapped the fragile letter in fresh paper. He wrote a short note in simple words. "Your Karl was brave. He's found this near Sedan, an American soldier." He mailed it to the address in Germany, hoping somehow it would reach her. Later that spring, Samuel planted a young oak tree near the farmhouse. At its roots, before covering them with soil, he placed 3 small things. The chess piece Joseph had given him after Patrick died, the small Bible Walter Green had carried until shrapnel took him, and a single gray button he'd found in the mud near where he'd last seen Karl Vogel. He patted the earth's firm around the sapling. To every armistice day after that, Samuel would stand by that oak tree as it grew tall and strong. Clara would find him there, looking east, towards the distant ocean. He didn't see fields or sky. He saw mud and silence and faces of boys who never came home. The war had been a monster that ate countries. But Samuel knew the terrible truth. It was ordinary people, men and women as simple as wheat, as fragile as a pressed flower who had paid its price. Peace wasn't a victory shout. It was a quiet promise they had to work on every single day.